I knew someone in the Air Force who worked drone surveillance overseas for a while. We weren't close enough for me to know exactly where he was stationed, but from the way he described it, I'm pretty sure it was somewhere in North Africa or the Middle East. Most of what he talked about sounded boring, honestly. Endless hours watching empty terrain through thermal cameras waiting for movement that never came. The way he explained it, drone work messes with your head after a while because you spend so much time staring at people from far away without context. Tiny figures walking through deserts, roads, villages. You start recognizing patterns in movement more than actual faces. He once told me operators could sometimes identify specific people just by the way they walked on infrared feeds. That's why he noticed the figures immediately. According to him, the area they were monitoring was an abandoned military zone, surrounded by old minefields left over from conflicts decades earlier. The entire region had been marked off-limits because maps of the mine placements were incomplete. Even local groups avoided crossing certain sections after multiple accidents over the years. The drone assignment itself was routine. Night surveillance over remote desert sectors where smugglers occasionally moved equipment through old border routes. Most shifts involved watching empty sand for 10 hours straight. Then one night, 3 human figures appeared crossing directly through the restricted minefield. At first, he assumed they were locals who didn't understand the danger zones, but the movement looked wrong immediately. Most people crossing hazardous terrain move cautiously. These figures walked in straight lines without hesitation. No flashlights, no visible gear, just steadily moving across one of the densest mine sectors in the region. His team expected detonations at any second. None happened. The figures crossed almost 2 kilometers of active minefield untouched. That alone should have triggered investigation because parts of the field were still considered live according to military records. A demining vehicle had exploded there less than a year earlier. My friend tagged the footage and zoomed closer for identification. That's when things started getting uncomfortable. The drone optics were good enough to distinguish clothing and body movement clearly despite the distance. All 3 figures appeared human-shaped, roughly average height, moving at normal walking speed, but their faces didn't resolve properly. At first, he blamed compression issues or heat distortion. Desert imaging gets messy sometimes because of thermal interference and air conditions, but even after switching optics and rerunning stabilization, the faces stayed blank. Not blurry, blank. Like smooth, pale surfaces where facial features should have been. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. He called another operator over just to confirm he wasn't imagining it. The second operator reportedly stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly asking, "Why are they walking like that?" That part bothered him more afterward because he hadn't consciously noticed it yet. The figures moved too evenly. Not robotic exactly. More like people imitating walking without natural variation. Same stride length, same arm movement, perfectly synchronized direction changes despite several meters separating them. Once he noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. They tracked the figures for almost 20 minutes as they crossed deeper into restricted terrain. Every few minutes, Command requested updated coordinates, but strangely never asked for closer visual confirmation. Normally, unidentified movement in a monitored military zone would escalate fast. Verification, interception planning, regional coordination. Instead, higher command just kept telling them to maintain visual tracking only. No engagement, no alerts, no discussion. Eventually, the figures disappeared behind a series of rock formations near the edge of the minefield. My friend redirected the drone, expecting to reacquire them on the opposite side. Nothing was there. No footprints either. That detail apparently disturbed the image analysts afterward because the sand conditions should have preserved tracks clearly under thermal review. The figures simply stopped existing between frames. The next morning, the footage vanished from the system archive. Not misplaced, removed. When my friend asked about it, a supervisor told him the recording had been classified under Equipment Anomaly Review. That explanation didn't hold up because everybody on shift saw the same footage live. Things might have ended there if the figures hadn't returned. 3 nights later, another drone crew spotted movement in the same minefield around the same time. This time there were 6 figures instead of 3. Same appearance, same synchronized movement, same featureless faces. One operator reportedly joked over comms asking if they were seeing mannequins walking through hell. Nobody laughed. The second sighting lasted longer because the drone followed them all the way to an abandoned outpost near the center of the restricted zone. The outpost had been empty for years after repeated mine incidents around the perimeter, but infrared scans showed heat signatures inside the structure before the figures arrived. Human-sized signatures, standing completely still. My friend wasn't operating that shift, but according to someone he trusted, Command abruptly ordered the drone camera redirected away from the outpost during visual approach. Not after confirming identities. Before, the operator protested because active unidentified movement inside a restricted military sector was exactly what they were supposed to monitor. Command responded by threatening disciplinary action if the feed wasn't redirected immediately. That's when rumors started spreading among crews that leadership already knew about the figures. Apparently, sightings went back years. Different operators, different sectors, always crossing active minefields untouched, always appearing during overnight surveillance windows. One contractor claimed ground patrol teams had attempted interception once and lost radio contact near the mine zone for almost 30 minutes. When communication returned, the patrol leader supposedly ordered immediate withdrawal without explanation. Official reports blamed navigation failure. Nobody believed that. My friend became obsessed after hearing the rumors. He started reviewing archived surveillance stills during downtime, trying to find previous incidents hidden under mislabeled files. Eventually, he found several. Most were incomplete or corrupted, but the figures were unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Small groups moving through prohibited areas with identical posture and spacing. Always at night, always in minefields. Then he found one clip that genuinely scared him. The footage came from years earlier during another operation entirely. A drone camera tracked two faceless figures walking near an abandoned convoy route, while soldiers monitored remotely from command. At one point, the camera zoomed extremely close on one figure's head. The surface where the face should have been wasn't smooth skin. It looked stretched, like something covered tightly over a human face underneath. The operator controlling the camera zoomed further instinctively. Then the figure looked directly upward into the drone lens, not generally upward, directly at it. The footage ended immediately afterward. My friend said he couldn't stop thinking about that clip because drone altitude at the time made visual detection practically impossible under normal conditions. A few weeks later, his own team encountered the figures again during a sandstorm surveillance operation. Visibility was terrible even with thermal enhancement, but multiple contacts appeared moving slowly across another restricted sector. This time there were dozens. He said they emerged gradually from the storm one by one, until the entire feed looked crowded with human shapes walking silently through the minefield. No detonations, no hesitation. Just rows of faceless figures crossing active explosives like they already knew where every mine was buried. One younger analyst panicked and asked command if they should notify nearby patrol units. The response came back immediately. Do not acknowledge visual details. That exact wording apparently froze the whole room. Not maintain observation. Not stand by. Do not acknowledge visual details. My friend told me the room got very quiet after that because everybody understood what it implied. Command didn't think the figures were equipment glitches. They thought seeing them mattered somehow. Then one of the figures stopped moving. The drone camera stabilized automatically as the shape slowly turned upward toward the lens. A second later, every other figure stopped too. Dozens of faceless heads tilted upward simultaneously toward the drone. The feed cut to static immediately afterward. Not signal loss. Static. For almost 11 seconds, the screen showed nothing but distortion and audio interference. During the noise, one operator swore he heard voices buried underneath the static speaking over each other. Then the feed returned. The minefield was empty. No figures, no tracks, nothing. My friend requested transfer off surveillance operations less than a month later. Before leaving, he asked one senior officer directly what the figures actually were. According to him, the officer sat silently for a while before saying, "The minefields aren't there to keep people out." Then he refused to elaborate further. The strangest part came afterward. A few months after returning stateside, my friend received an encrypted email from another operator he used to work with overseas. It only contained a single image attachment. Night vision still frame. Empty desert. At first it looked like nothing. Then he noticed the edge of the photograph. Partially obscured near the bottom corner stood a figure facing the camera from much closer range than any previous footage. Close enough that facial details should have been visible. There still weren't any. That should have been the end of it. But about a year later, my friend contacted me out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken in months. He asked if I still remembered the story about the minefields. I told him I did. There was a long pause before he said he had received another email. No sender, no subject line, no text, just another image. This one wasn't taken from a drone. It looked like a ground photograph. The picture showed an old military observation post overlooking part of the restricted zone. The minefield stretched across the horizon. At first, he thought the image was empty. Then he started counting. There were figures standing out there. Not 3, not 6. Dozens, maybe hundreds, spread across the desert, every single one facing the camera. The worst part was what came next. Someone had attached coordinates to the image metadata. When he checked them, they didn't point to the Middle East. They didn't point to Africa either. The coordinates led to an abandoned military testing range in the United States, thousands of miles away from the original sightings. My friend never got a third email. At least not that he told me about. But after that conversation, I started noticing something strange. Every photograph he showed me from overseas only contained the figures at a distance, far enough away that details were impossible to make out, except for the last image. The one taken on the ground. The one with hundreds of them staring directly toward the camera, because after zooming in, I realized something. A few of the figures actually did have faces. Not normal faces, recognizable faces. They looked like the people who had taken the photographs, drone operators, analysts, personnel, people who had spent years watching the minefields. When I pointed that out, my friend immediately asked me to delete the image. I asked him why. He never answered. A few days later, his phone number stopped working. His social media accounts disappeared. And nobody I know has heard from him since. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe he just wanted a fresh start somewhere. But I still think about something that senior officer said. The minefields aren't there to keep people out. At the time, it sounded mysterious. Now it sounds like a warning. Because if those figures really were crossing active minefields without triggering anything, then maybe they weren't trespassing. Maybe they belonged there. And sometimes I wonder if the real purpose of the surveillance program wasn't to watch the minefields at all. Maybe it was to keep track of whatever was moving through them. The thing that still bothers me most, though, is the possibility that the figures weren't getting closer to the cameras. The cameras were getting closer to them. And eventually, after enough years of watching, they started looking back.